This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, producer of the show. On today's episode, Ann Hyslop, Director of Policy Development at All4Ed, joins Mike and David to discuss the evolving federal role in K-12 education, particularly how the Secretary of Education's waiver authority impacts state flexibility on spending and testing under ESSA. Then, on the Research Minute, Amber examines a new study out of Massachusetts that finds students in departmentalized elementary schools tend to perform better in middle school, especially in the first year. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming this week's special guest, Ann Hyslop. Ann, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's great to be here.
Yeah, Ann is the Director of Policy Development at All4Ed. Also joining us, as always, my colleague, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Ann.
Hey.
It is great to have you both here. I should say that Ann, among many great roles in education policy, was formerly in the Obama administration. And tell me if I get this right, Ann, that you were there both for the NCLB waiver time as well as the transition into ESSA. That fair to say?
That is right. Yeah. So one of the things that we were working on right when I came into the department was doing another round of renewals for all of the states that had NCLB flexibility, as it was called at the time. But then also maybe my first or second week on the job was one of the markups for the bill that eventually became ESSA. So I was there for kind of the winding down of the last big time we were talking about ESEA waivers, and then sort of for the start of ESSA and some of the changes that were made in ESSA as a direct response to the waiver package.
Well, that makes you a master of waivers, and it's a good thing because that is a topic people are interested in. And let's talk about that on Ed Reform Update. All right, Ann, you and your colleagues at Education First put out a great paper recently, which we will put in the show notes, about waivers under ESSA, how they work, as well as the limitations. And as you mentioned, right, there are strict limitations now. This was after some folks in Congress named Lamar Alexander and his staffer, David Cleary, were mad that Arne Duncan had used his waiver authority so aggressively to basically have a quid pro quo. Right, to say, if you want these waivers from some of the provisions of No Child Left Behind that maybe weren't working very well at the time, then you've got to commit to some real education reforms that we think are good for kids. And some folks in Congress, they maybe didn't, they maybe didn't like some of the reforms, like Common Core. Maybe they liked some of the other ones, like support for charter schools, but they really didn't like having the Secretary of Education have so much power. And so in ESSA, they tried to rein that in and so got very specific about what is waivable and what is not. And I believe that's what you wrote about in this brief. So let's talk about that. Really two big buckets. One is around money and how it can be spent and who decides and where it goes. And the second around testing. Okay, so start with the money. I mean, is it fair to say right now and for a long time, Title I and the other formula funds, they have these, they're called formula funds because they have a formula. They go through the states, but most of the money continues all the way to school districts and charter schools. And the formula says not only how much each state gets, but each district gets. And so is there anything where if a state, let's say Oklahoma, right, under Ryan, under the state superintendent there, wanted to say, hey, we want to change how much money each school district gets, or we would like to just take the money that is supposed to flow through the school districts and decide what we would like to do with it instead. Is that the sort of stuff that they cannot do under the law?
Yes. I think for the most part, since the waiver authority the secretary's ability to sort of say to a state, you don't have to follow this requirement of ESEA. It's been around a long time. We're talking pre-NCLB, so early 1990s. But the formulas have always been unwaivable, to my knowledge. Haven't gone back to like every single iteration of ESEA before 1994, but at least in the 1994 version, also unwaivable. So the formulas, which, whether it's Title I or Title II, Title III, they do spell out pretty clearly how much each district gets based on certain factors. And the state can set aside some of that money for state administration, but the amount that a district gets cannot be waived by the Secretary of Education. They do not have the authority to rewrite those formulas through executive action alone. They also don't, critically with Title I, another piece that is unwaivable is how districts do what sort of is called rank ordering schools. Because Title I funds, unlike a lot of other federal funds, have to be spent in Title I schools. Title II funds can be spent district-wide, but Title I funds need to be spent on the schools that have the highest shares of students from low-income families. And that process for ranking and ordering which schools you're going to serve based on the share of students from low-income families in the school, that cannot be waived either. Mm-hmm. And about, roughly, we called in our brief that All for Ed and Education First wrote, we called the 10 provisions that the Secretary has no authority to waive the unwaivables, and 5 of them have to do with funding.
Yeah. So, and it makes sense. I mean, you think about the politics of this, right? Senators don't want to all of a sudden wake up one day and find out that there was a waiver that took money away from their state and gave it to somebody else. And nor do members of Congress want to find out that money was taken from.
Has always lied with Congress, that's hundreds of years old. So really, the funding is sort of the heart of what can't be waived.
All right. Now, the law does include, as No Child Left Behind did a little bit of this, and there's been some provisions in ESSA to try to allow for some flexibility, right? And tell me if this is, my basic understanding is that at both the state and local level, there's some ability, for example, to transfer money from one pot to another, especially into Title I, because Title I tends to have, the most restrictions in terms of at least where it needs to end up. Right. So that's fair. Right. So already, if you're a district that would like to just take their Title II money and put it into the Title I pot, they can do that already. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. There's a whole section of ESEA called transferability. And essentially the Title II grants, which are mostly for teacher professional development, school leadership, all of that money can be moved into Title I. All of that money can also be moved into Title IV, which is the student support and academic enrichment grants. It actually can be moved in a lot of different ways at the district and at the state level. That's student support and academic enrichment grant, Title IV Part A, which funds things like safe and healthy schools and well-rounded education, having STEM and arts and music. It also supports technology in the classroom. Mm-hmm. That money is also similarly transferable. You can transfer it into Title II. You could transfer it into Title I. Mm-hmm. But the key piece with that transferability piece is that money cannot flow out of Title I.
Right.
That is very clear. So there are these pots that can be sort of interchangeable. You can make all your Title II funds, Title IV funds, and vice versa. But you can't take Title I funds and make them Title III for English learners or Title II.
And I think what a lot of people worry about, and when they hear that, the states are asking for block grants, for example, and I think the Oklahoma, there wasn't really, the request was very, I think.
Request in air quotes.
In air quotes, right? The request, yes, which was not very spelled out. But I think the big concern people have is that, a state would say, hey, just give us all the money and we will, for example, turn it into a voucher program that we decide how it works and where it goes to, right? And it may or may not, be a voucher program even for the Title I kids, right? Or it may be a voucher program that, again, a lot of people in Washington wouldn't be happy about because they don't support vouchers. My read then of what you're saying, what I'm hearing is that is not in any way allowable under the law. Is that true?
I can't come up with even the most creative interpretation of the law under which that would be possible.
Right. Now, if they wanted to take that little state set aside and do something sort of out of the box with the state portion, which is pretty small, maybe they could do something like that.
I still think it'd be very hard to send the money to private schools.
To
Like,
private schools. Okay.
yeah, I think that is, if it sort of the ESEA funding for public education, I think that's a really hard barrier. That would be hard to do. But there are things that I think are within the realm of possibility. For example, like there's been a lot of talk, I think, looking at both the Oklahoma request as well as sort of plans coming out of Iowa of this idea of, right, like, can we just throw all these different pots of money together and have it be one bigger pot of money that's easier to manage and distribute?
Yeah.
At the state level, that can already be done. You actually don't need a waiver to do that with that out of Title I, out of Title II, these different pots of money. States set aside a small portion for administration. States already have the ability under Title VIII of ESSA to combine their administrative funds across programs into a single pot of money. There is a caveat on that, and that is that at least half of the state's agency's budget has to come from non-federal sources. So I don't know if that's the case in Iowa and Oklahoma. If they're saying 75% of our state agency budget comes from federal sources, they couldn't take advantage of that flexibility. But this is where the lack of details in these requests, I think, makes it hard to know actually what they're asking to do. But there definitely are things that I think would help with some of these problems. It's just not going to get you all the way to doing a voucher program with federal funding. I mean, you remember when ESSA was being debated, Title I portability, the idea that Title I funds could follow the child. That was an idea that Senator Alexander threw out, and it was rejected.
Yeah.
So the idea that then something like that could be done through waiver, no, that was debated in ESSA and was rejected and is not possible.
Yeah. I mean, that idea
ESSA again.
Right. I mean, Title I portability, that idea goes back, I think, to the early 70s. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you might find Checker Finn lurking in the background. So, yeah, that idea keeps coming out. It was rejected. David, questions on the money point?
Yeah, I'm almost too stupid to ask a question here, Mike. But I mean, I just want to make sure that we've accounted for all the money, right? So, for example, when we're talking about I know that there are other streams, like I think McKinney-Vento, is a different stream. Am I correct? And that the rules that you're talking about don't apply to that, right? So, okay.
That's for homeless kids.
Yeah.
Speak to that, or is that outside your...
It's a different law, and there's not a waiver authority in the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. So that's a different stream. We're also not talking about Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act funding, IDEA for special education. This is just the programs in ESEA, which is, the big one is Title I, but there are the bigger next sort of behind that would be Title II for teachers, Title III for English learners, Title IV, which includes this block grant, but also after school programs are in Title IV too.
Yeah. And this might be a tougher one in terms of how the money is spent. So then let's say, okay, a state wants to create a new rule about what districts can or cannot spend their Title I money on. Okay, let's say, in my dream world, if I were the state superintendent, I would say, you can't have that money flowing you can't pay teachers with this Title I money if you have a single salary schedule in your district, or if you are providing extra money for master's degrees, which we know does not work, or if you are not in some way providing significantly higher salaries for teachers in Title I schools than in other schools, then you can't use this money. I mean, something like that, can a state create rules like that maybe, or ask for permission to do so?
So that would be a tough one, only because there's actually a provision in ESEA called comparability that districts are subject to that says having a single district-wide salary schedule is sufficient to demonstrate comparability. So I think you end up in this place of, if a state were trying to impose that condition or restriction on Title I funds and a district didn't want to, that question may need to be settled in court of some kind.
All right.
I think there are other things, though, like your point, though, of the state can nudge, if not all out require, but really nudge districts into certain types of behaviors. Because in order to get federal funds, every district writes a consolidated plan. Just like I know Fordham spent a lot of time looking at the state consolidated plans. So did we at All for Ed. There's a district version of that.
Hmm.
And the state agency every year, has the ability to approve these plans as a condition for districts getting federal funding.
Hmm.
And they can design what those plans look like. They can ask in those plans, describe the high quality instructional materials that
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
using that are aligned with the science of reading. And they could say that. That's clearly a practice that is going to help students who are low achieving achieve the grade level standards. And simply asking districts to explain that can nudge them or
Hmm.
sort of they will then start to explain what curriculum that they're using and how they're ensuring that the science of reading is in their classroom. So I think that there are definitely ways that states can get creative in terms of leveraging the federal funds to encourage certain practices because, these Title I funds are actually quite flexible in terms of how they can be used, so long as they're spent in Title I schools.
All right. Thank you. That's super helpful. I'm sure to our listeners and viewers as well. So on funding, it's pretty buttoned up. On testing, on the other hand, as we remember from March of 2020, it is possible for the Secretary of Education to waive the annual testing requirements. Right now, pandemic's over. Let's hope we don't have another one of those in our lifetime. Could the Secretary of Education decide to just waive testing requirements and tell all the states, hey, it's up to you whether you want to keep testing kids? Which, by the way, we talked about this last week with Scott Marion, who made a very strong case that even if that did happen, yes, states should keep testing kids. But what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so unlike the sort of limitations on the secretary's authority around waiving funding provisions, in theory, the secretary has the authority to waive the assessment provisions. We saw that, as you said, in 2020. So in theory, we could see a secretary waive all of the assessment requirements.
Mhm.
However, I think that there are some new limitations or new hurdles, perhaps, that have to be jumped over in order for that to happen for a state. These may not be the highest hurdles or barriers in the world, but they are new and they exist. So when the assessment provisions are being waived in particular, in addition to a state explaining how the waiver request, if it were approved, is going to advance student achievement and student performance and student outcomes, they also need to explain how they will continue to have the same level of transparency to parents and the public in reporting on student achievement. And that includes reporting for individual groups of students. So simply saying, we still have like a statewide assessment or we'll have NAEP, that's not a good enough. That shouldn't be good enough. But
Mhm.
ultimately, it's up to, the U.S. Department of Education to sort of how much they ask states to demonstrate and what is good enough. So this is definitely an area where there aren't as many handcuffs on this agency in terms of what they can waive. That said, I think we haven't seen really any indication from the folks at the Department of Education right now that this is something that they would like to do. If anything, they talk about returning back to the basics and like we need to focus on reading and math, and we really need to be ensuring that students are, meeting grade level standards and going to be ready to succeed after high school.
Mhm.
So I haven't seen necessarily the indication of this, but it doesn't mean that states may not be interested. And
Right.
like Scott, I would say, I hope that they aren't interested because I think it's very important to keep these measures in place.
Yeah. And we worked, we really walked through with Scott last week, are there some of these provisions that you could tweak,
Mhm.
testing every other year to save some time, or just doing a sample of, each kid takes a different form and maybe they don't, get all the material covered so that it's a shorter test. And you walk through all of these different ideas and there's costs to all of them, and so yes, I think the hope is to say, hey, grades 3 through 8, reading and math, one's in high school, science and grade span doesn't seem so onerous. But yeah, you do wonder if states are going to propose something. They also here too have some already authority to propose something around the innovation of assessments, right?
Yeah.
And so that is another route versus a waiver. All right, but let me give you one example. Again, we'll just play. Lamar Alexander called this "May I, Mother" to the Secretary of Education. So, may I, Anne? Let's say a state says, okay, for high school testing, right now we require everybody to take the SAT. We would like to move to saying you can choose either the SAT or the ACT at the district level. Or, you know what? You can choose either the SAT or the Work Keys program if you'd like to have Work Keys tests for your CTE kids. Uh, could Secretary McMahon say yes to that?
So in theory, like again, everything can be waived with assessments.
Yeah.
So yes, like that, I don't think that there are the same kind of legal barriers where I say like no on block grants. I can't think of the creative
Hmm.
legal interpretation that allows you to do that. Yes, that is possible. Do I think it's advisable? No. Um, I think that
Yeah.
like the ACT work keys is not measuring reading and math.
Hmm.
It's not measuring those content standards. So right there, I think it's not equivalent to the other two. There is already flexibility in ESSA
Hmm.
to allow districts to pick between ACT or SAT, and states have utilized that. So
Oh,
part of this flexibility or this request, I think, is more sort of within the scope of what members of Congress who put ESSA into place were already thinking of or contemplating as possible. But I think the work keys piece would be a new one. And you know, would they like to waive that? Ultimately up to the folks at the Department of Education, but I don't think that would be a very good plan. And I can only imagine if when I was back at Ed, we probably would not have entertained that request.
gotcha. Gotcha. And look, I mean, again, I'm just floating this as an
Yeah.
example, though, as someone who thinks we went too far with the College for All, who thinks it's a great development that we're getting serious again about high quality CTE. I do worry about making every kid take the SAT, for example, isn't exactly sending the signal that we value both, preparation for traditional college routes and career technical education. David, you want to get in on this one?
Well,
Testing waivers?
I kind of disagree with that last point. I guess my only remaining question would be, for Anne, is there anything we haven't talked about yet that you think, I don't know, let's say you were a state leader and you had your encyclopedic knowledge of federal waiver, whatever. Is there anything you actually think state leaders should do, right? That maybe they haven't thought of, that would actually be good for kids, that isn't strictly prohibited by the law, but they might think,
Yeah.
is.
Yes. So I think there actually are a lot of things that states sometimes think they need waivers to do that they don't need waivers to do. Like the things I was talking about with redesigning your application for districts so that you're actually asking them about state priorities. Like you have authority to do that.
Mhm.
Just do it. I know it's hard work. Like that takes time, but you don't need the Department of Education kind of blessing that from you. You can go ahead and start designing a better application that actually emphasizes the strategic priorities in your state and asks how federal funds are going toward like helping advance those priorities. I think there are places where I see, and I'm very interested to just kind of like get the readout for how this year went, but with what Montana is doing, they have gotten a waiver for field testing a new assessment. So some of their districts are taking a new through year assessment this year, but not every district is. So they needed a waiver because they weren't giving the same test statewide and they didn't want to have to double test students that were participating in that pilot or that field test. Like that's a very interesting approach. It's been used in the past when the Common Core aligned assessments were first developed so that students weren't being double tested on the old MCAS and PARC at the same time in Massachusetts case. So thinking about if you are interested in developing a new assessment, maybe a new computer adaptive test or into through-year model, like using that field test flexibility to help you get it implemented,
Mhm.
I think is a really good idea to think about and like what safeguards you would need around that. But I think so much attention has often been placed on what's like the innovative assessment demonstration authority or pilot that this idea of just like, oh, we could ask for a waiver to field test this kind of got lost, where it's sort of almost a much easier, faster glide path to get to a new state assessment. There's some interesting things too, where states who, have instead of giving SAT or ACT in high school, they have the end of course assessments, which I know is something Fordham has written a lot about, getting waivers so that students who are taking those assessments early can take the assessment that's aligned with their course. So if you're a middle school student who is taking high school biology, you could take the biology assessment rather than the grade 8 science tests. So I think things like that, where it's helping to bring assessment and instruction more in line with one another, that's a really smart use of the waiver authority.
All right. Well, speaking of smart, Anne, the smartest person we know on this topic of waivers, thank you so much, Anne, for coming on the show again. Anne Hyslop at All for Ed. I hope you all check out her article on the unwaverables, and I hope you come back sometime soon.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here.
All right. Now it's time for everyone's favorite, Amber's Research Minute. Amber, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Mike.
So I have to say, we just had our Fordham staff retreat, and I don't mean to brag, but my team won the Fordham History Trivia contest, edging out Amber's team.
Yes.
You've been here bragging, Mike.
A tad longer, but I think I lost out on was it 1981 or 1983 when we did something. What was that question again?
That was even before Fordham. It was when did the Educational Excellence Network begin?
There you go.
1981, before A Nation at Risk. This was something that Checker founded with Diane Ravitch. Yes. So there you go. There was some question about whether I was allowed to participate, not only because I lead the organization, but because I've actually lived through most of Fordham's history. So I did try to step back. And then once we entered the Amber era, that I had to step back as well.
Yeah. I figured you were passing them the answers under the table or something.
Oh, come on.
They were doing too good.
But David, where was your team? You had no excuse on any of this.
We did fine. What are you saying?
All right. Well, yes. So we are a competitive bunch at Fordham. So if there's anything that can be turned into a competition, we will find a way. And
yes.
So I don't know if that's like team building best practice or not, but that's how we roll. So
yes. And did you get the prize? How come you haven't told folks about the prize?
What prize? What do you mean? Oh, the
T-shirt.
I didn't get the T-shirt. Oh, right. Who did get the T-shirt?
Your winning team got the T-shirt with your face on it, plastered in 6 different ways. So
somebody had some fun with some of my my headshots through the years, and they didn't even pick the most embarrassing ones from our videos. So
it's true. It's true. But it was different hair stages, Mike. You must
very depressing.
You must admit.
Yes, that is true. I do miss those earlier on the hair front. Okay, that is enough. What you got for research this week?
All right. We're going to go for a new study out from Calder. You guys know we love Calder. They're looking at the impacts of elementary school departmentalization. This is also a topic that we like. I've done studies in the past, but this one, just to get people up to speed, it's when teachers specialize in one or more core subjects, as opposed to staying with the same group of kids all day in a self-contained classroom. Prior research has found mixed impacts of departmentalization at the elementary level. We're going to call it DI, departmentalized instruction, not to be confused with direct instruction. But virtually all of the prior studies looked at short-term effects. And this is really, I think, one of the only, if not the only one, that's able to look at long-term effects. So our buddies Dan Goldhaber and friends follow 7 cohorts of elementary school students in Massachusetts who were enrolled as 3rd graders between 2012 and 2018, so before COVID. And they're looking at outcomes between the 5th and 10th grade. So they follow them, into high school. They omit K-8 schools because they are examining that middle school transition piece. So you've got K4, K5, and K6 schools, but most of them are K5 schools in the sample. They use a difference in difference design that exploits variation in DI practices across cohorts in the same elementary school. So they're calculating the number of years of exposure that students have to DI in elementary school between grade 3 and the highest grade offered in that school. So it's more of an intent to treat analysis. And they're comparing changes in the outcomes for students who attend elementary schools that switch to DI or to self-contained models. So they make a switch from one to the other. And they're looking at other cohorts in the same middle or high school whose elementary schools did not switch models. Okay. All right. First, on the descriptive side, 1 year of DI is associated with an increase in the likelihood of departmentalization of 29 percentage points in third grade, and then it keeps going up. So then you've got 35 percentage points in fourth grade, and then you've got, I think, it must have said, it says 23, but yeah, in fifth grade, and then 3 percentage points in sixth grade. So it's a higher likelihood, obviously, that you are going to keep seeing DI. The impact analysis finds that the average effect is small and insignificant. So that's not the story, but the story is when they dig into grade level and they actually see benefits for students who attend DI elementary schools at that level. So they're finding moderately large effects in sixth grade. And then, that's the grade that most kids are transitioning because most of the sample is K-5. So then they basically find that there aren't any impacts in the other grades. Those are all insignificant results. And then they dig more and they basically find that the results are almost entirely concentrated in that first year of middle school, where each year of DI improves math and ELA scores by 0.03 standard deviation in the transitional grade, but fade out by eighth grade. And this was interesting. The science results stuck around the longest. So those actually made it into eighth grade, where the other effects stopped at eighth grade, and they made it into high school biology. And the researchers say, well, maybe that's because science is the subject that tends to get the least instructional time in the self-contained classroom. And then they look at about half of the positive effect in the transition year is driven by improvements in learning during elementary school. The other half, because they're like, is this real? And the other half comes from a smaller decline in the achievement during that middle school transition, which tends to be problematic anyway. And then the total effect of having attended a fully departmentalized elementary school is pretty much enough to offset that middle school transition effect found in prior research that we know already happens. And then finally, since DI means that kids tend to get teachers with more specialized knowledge, they also look at teacher value added, and they find that a greater proportion of math teachers' contributions to test scores persist into middle schools when elementary schools are practicing DI. So I guess the question is it worth doing? How hard it would be to do? And so on and so forth. And and any thoughts about it, the transition year, where we're seeing those concentrated effects?
Yeah, no, really interesting. Look, my prior, I've always thought that this should work, right? I mean, if you just do a computer simulation and you say, well, if we had our best math teachers teaching all the kids math, and the stronger reading teachers teaching all the kids reading, if there was even just a comparative advantage, that should raise achievement. And yet there's been studies in the past that try the departmentalization and get either null or even negative findings, I think. So this looks like null to positive. This transition thing, it reminds me of a recent Fordham study. Do you know what I'm talking about, David?
Which one? Is it the GPA value added study, Mike?
It is, or the study that I like to refer to as indicators of middle school and high school readiness.
Right.
Yes. That we found, the folks that we worked with found that you could come up with a metric of whether elementary schools, for example, were doing a better or worse job preparing kids to succeed once they got to middle school. But it's a black box. We don't have any way in that study to know what those schools that do better might be doing. Well, maybe this is one answer. Maybe departmentalization in at least fifth grade is something you can do to prepare your students to do better once they get to middle school. Perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like there's some randomized controlled trial that says you should start departmentalizing in sixth grade, right? It's not like we made some super research-based decision to start middle school in sixth grade. Maybe somebody with more experience knows exactly why we do it this way, right? But it's not it's not it's not written in the sky, and I don't hear a whole lot of arguments being made for, changing middle school so that all the kids are in one classroom and the teacher has to teach all the subjects, which suggests to me that kind of everyone's gut feeling is that if anything, we should push it down, right, and do what you're talking about. So that's also where my gut feeling is as well. I can't really explain why the prior research hasn't found that, but this one is more in line with my gut instinct. I guess I also I want to make sure I understand what we're talking about. So can you just remind us, Amber, are they just departmentalizing into math, science, and reading or humanities? Remind me, what does it actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, they actually did not define the subjects that they were departmentalizing in, but I'm assuming, right, that it's typical to be ELA and social studies and math and science.
Okay.
And
Right.
I wonder, did they know this from some kind of survey, or can they just see it in the data that they can tell that they know the kids' test scores and they know if the test scores are correlated with the teacher?
Yeah, I'm assuming they looked into the data. There's no, the only survey they used was actually on environmental, culture and all that. And I didn't report on any of that because the differences in engagement weren't significant, as I recall.
Yeah. So it could be that, for example, some schools might have also had social studies separate, but if there was no social studies test, then we wouldn't know that. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to state the obvious, it's not like there's some binary choice here, right? You could do elements of this, right? You could have, you could pull the kids out for science or social studies or whatever it is on some basis. You could have a homeroom teacher who covers a lot of what the kid does. You could have team teachers, one of whom is science and math, the other of whom is, humanities, social studies, and English. I mean, I won't. I could go on, but the point is, I don't think we have to necessarily take a cookie cutter approach to this. I feel like, at least at the school level, we could go with what teachers are good at, right? Is what I'm trying to get at here, right? You could start with, what do I have if you're a principal? What am I working with? Can Mr. Smith teach math well or not? Seems like a sort of first order question. And if he can't, then I feel like there's a strong case for, departmentalization, right? Or rethinking whatever it is, rethinking a model that insists that he teach math, right? So I guess that's kind of where my head goes, is like, I find it hard to believe that all teachers are good at all subjects. Many teachers aren't even particularly good at their subject. And so I feel like some of this is desirable. And if you're not at least asking the question, then you're probably not getting it exactly right.
But you wouldn't go so far as to say we need to specialize in elementary certification, would you?
I mean, I don't have I'm more just thinking in terms of, these skills that the teachers have. I wouldn't go that far. No, I mean, I wouldn't. I think that we should probably, I see no reason that elementary preparation can't include, subject specific preparation. I mean, it should, right? But no, I don't think I don't think certification is necessarily the answer, right? I mean, I think just flexibility at the school level to sort of do what makes sense. I sound like a Fordham person, but that's, to me, that's the most important thing, right? Is looking at what the skills that the teacher is actually working with on day one, when they're getting ready to start teaching, and saying, what do these actual observable skill sets suggest about, kind of how the job should be divvied up. I don't know.
All right. Well said, David. We will leave it there. Thank you, Amber. I like it. It's practical. It has to do with a real question schools have, right?
Yes. Yes.
Very useful research. We need more of that. Way to go, Dan and Calder.
Yes.
All right. Well, that is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week.
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.